Today's story was written by Reddit user Dun Ruffle. The dwarfs had long been known as master craftsmen and inventors, but a closely guarded secret amongst their kind were those known as the listeners. These rare individuals had the gift to hear the voice and spirit of the weapons they touched. The listeners were integral to the Dwarven Kingdom, as by simply touching unknown weapons, they could understand their use, design, and purpose. During a particularly dark and gloomy night, a group of dwarfs clad in ceremonial armour and robes stepped out of an armoured truck and were met by a tall human man wearing the uniform of an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. It had been less than a year since the elves had managed to open the magical dimensional portal to this world called Earth, and the dwarfs were part of a mission to determine the military capability of the humans. The World Council was led by the leaders of the different races, the dwarfs, elves, orcs, dragons, and beastmen. The alliance of these 5 races had crushed all other opposition in their world, and with their world fully under their control, it was decided to expand their influence even further, hence the construction of the dimensional portal. The mission was to subtly determine how dangerous the human race was, and whether their world should be conquered or befriended. The human race was certainly strange and unique to the World Council. They had no magic, fought their own kind over petty differences, and had smithing techniques completely different from anything seen before in the fantasy world. Even with the strange machines the humans had, the World Council had almost unanimously agreed that the humans were going to be easy pickings. Humans had long abandoned the way of the sword, wore armour that could barely stop an arrow, and had no magic to speak of. Of course, the World Council was not foolish enough to immediately begin their conquest. They would discover the secrets of the humans under the guise of peace. Once they knew the strengths and weaknesses of the humans and their technology, they would utilise the knowledge to devastating effect. While most dwarfs would deny that they were greedy, it was an open secret that the dwarven smiths and inventors were practically voracious in their desire to learn new information about inventions and weapons. After all, the dwarfs had long monopolised the weapon manufacturing market for the armies of the World Council. Any opportunity to solidify their grip on the World Council's members' purses was a welcome one. So now the delegation of 5 dwarfs was the first to visit an Air Force base belonging to the country known as the United States of America. Listener Maverick stood silently in his ceremonial chainmail and red robe as the leader of the 5 dwarfs conversed politely with the Lieutenant Colonel. Maverick had no aptitude or diplomacy, or politeness. His only interest was in weapons, and that was the sole reason why they were here. He would be the first listener to interact with the flying swords called aircraft. After a few minutes of talking, the 5 dwarfs were escorted past tall gates, topped with barbed wire, and stepped into the Air Force base. A dozen large hangars bordered a large runway, and as the dwarfs were given the tour of the different kinds of aircraft, Maverick barely listened to the long-winded Lieutenant Colonel, for even if he did, many of the words and phrases he was spouting off had no meaning to Maverick. Things like close air support, air superiority, and AWACS were clearly terms that humans had created to describe things Maverick had never seen before. Instead, Maverick focused his eyes on the angular vehicles in front of him. He would give credit where it was due. The humans clearly had far more advanced technology than the World Council, most likely to compensate for their lack of magic. The World Council used dragons, griffin riders, drake knights, and other flying creatures to attack from the air. Even the greatest dwarven minds had not managed to piece together a siege machine that could fly. But technology alone would not save the humans. Maverick was sure of that. The humans could not hear the spirits of the weapons they created, so how could they even begin to understand how best to utilize them? Sure, the human aircraft were intimidating at first glance, but Maverick was confident that once he listened to the spirits of the machines, all of the secrets of the human weapons would be laid bare. They saw several aircraft, but the first one that Maverick got to physically interact with was called an F-22 Raptor. It was a beautiful piece of metal and engineering, and Maverick eyed it excitedly as he tried to prevent his eagerness from showing too much. With permission from the Lieutenant Colonel, Maverick approached the metal beast and gently placed his hand on the side of the fuselage, like he was merely admiring its construction. Maverick could not stop a small grin from forming on his bearded face as the familiar sensation of the weapon's spirit began to flood his mind. How foolish the humans were to let him get so close to their finest weapons. Weapon spirits had various levels of sentience depending on their construction and complexity. A shabby iron sword would only give the occasional pulse of emotion, but a master-crafted elf rapier might even go so far as to have a distinct voice and brief images of its use. Then there were weapons like the finest dwarf siege engines, things like the auto-loading ballista or the feared flamecaster siege tower. These magnificent weapons would have memories lasting as long as half a day, their proud spirits recalling events with vibrant images that recounted events like a picture book flipping through its pages. But what met Maverick's mind was far beyond what he had expected. Maverick could see through the eyes of the machine in full detail, as if he was experiencing it himself. And it was not just still images, recordings played out in full fluid motion. And Maverick felt his heart skip a beat as he viewed the Raptor screaming through the blue sky above the clouds. The machine dove and twisted through the air with speed far beyond anything Maverick had seen before. In the blink of an eye, Maverick witnessed the Raptor declaring its dominance of the sky. If Maverick had to compare the spirit of the Raptor to something, it was like a young champion show horse. It knew it was the best at what it did, and looked down at all the lesser aircraft trying to replicate a fraction of its abilities. This Raptor had only been on one actual combat mission, and it had been over in less than 10 minutes. The arrogant machine sneering as it had vaporized its slow opponent in the blink of an eye high above the clouds. All of its other memories were of training flights and showcases, the spirit reveling in the adoration, awe, and envy that it received in the spotlight. This Raptor was still very young, so it had not found its true voice yet. Maverick was astounded by the complexity of the machine in front of him, for it was 20 times more complex than even the greatest siege engine the Dwarven Kingdom had ever produced. Pulling his hand away from the F-22, Maverick frowned as the Lieutenant Colonel obliviously regaled the other dwarfs with stories about the F-22 series of aircraft. Moving on from the prideful Raptor, Maverick stroked his beard absent-mindedly, as he dutifully followed the other dwarfs behind the Lieutenant Colonel. His initial confidence in Dwarven technology was wavering. Were all human weapons this complex and lethal? If so, the World Council was severely underestimating the capabilities of humans. Maverick knew he would need to meet with the other listeners to discuss their findings. Even if they understood how to replicate these machines, the World Council did not even have the means to produce most of the parts, or obtain the necessary materials. As the tour went on, Maverick was disappointed to see that he was not being allowed to interact with any more aircraft. They saw plenty sitting in their respective hangars, but now it was clear that the F-22 Raptor was indeed living up to its comparison of a champion show horse. Nearing the final hangar, Maverick spotted an aircraft shrouded in darkness. The lights of the hangar had been turned off, but Maverick could see that the shape of the aircraft was unlike any of the others they had seen. His curiosity getting the better of him, Maverick asked the Lieutenant Colonel if he could be allowed to properly see the final plane. The human officer paused, as it seemed he was nearing the end of his prepared tour. "Well, that one is not exactly in the best shape," the man explained. "It just returned from a mission a few hours ago, and still needs to be repaired. I am sure you all would not want to see something unsightly like that." Now Maverick's attention was piqued. If this machine was damaged, perhaps it would be willing to divulge more human secrets. It was not unprecedented for neglected or mistreated weapons to assist listeners in return for revenge. "Nonsense," Maverick replied seriously. "Wounds sustained in righteous combat are worthy of glory and remembrance. I implore you to allow me a glimpse of such a machine." It was not the best lie Maverick could come up with, but he hoped the human's ignorance would compensate. The man stroked his chin in thought, before letting out a small sigh and shrugging. "If that is what you want, Master Dwarf, I suppose it wouldn't hurt." As the officer motioned to his nearby subordinates to turn on the hangar lights, Maverick felt his anticipation rise. Perhaps this would be an opportunity to plant the seed of humanity's downfall. The group stepped into the hangar as the lights flickered to life to reveal an aircraft with a shape unlike all the others. It had a long middle section with a rounded front, 2 long wings, and 2 bulbous engines on the rear end of the middle section. This particular plane had multiple bullet holes in its fuselage, scorch marks on the wings, and fanged maw painted on its front. "This here is an A-10 Thunderbolt II," the human officer explained uncaringly with a wave of his hand. "It is an older model of aircraft that has gotten multiple upgrades over the years to remain competitive in the modern world. It's not the best looking aircraft and it's not that fast, but I will admit it has been reliable for a long time. Unlike modern multi-role aircraft like the F-35, it is designed to only specialise in close air support of ground forces. Frankly, we have been trying to get rid of the A-10s for a long time and replace them with modern aircraft, but it has proven difficult." The Air Force officer chuckled. The grunts love them so much, so I guess that counts for something. As the officer continued to ramble on about the inadequacies of the A-10, Maverick slowly approached the battered aircraft with curious eyes. Even the most ignorant dwarven smiths knew not to insult the weapons they wielded. Why would you insult and degrade a weapon you depended on to kill your enemies and protect your comrades? Doing so was disrespectful at best, and downright dangerous at worst. Maverick had seen what such ignorance was capable of doing: siege weapons malfunctioning at the worst possible moments, swords breaking in the middle of duels, arrows missing critically important targets. Such things became commonplace if you did not give your weapons the respect they deserved. Walking up to the wounded aircraft, Maverick reached out and touched its forward landing gear with great expectation. This was an opportunity that needed to be exploited to the fullest degree if the World Council wanted to unlock the secrets of the humans. At first, Maverick felt nothing, and for a second he wondered if the aircraft spirit was dead, or so disheartened that it had given up on retaining its sentience. But he was wrong. He was oh so very wrong. The aircraft had been taking a nap, and he had just woken it up. Maverick felt his mind lurch in fear as a bestial snarl only he could hear filled his head. Maverick was frozen in place as time around him slowed to a crawl while he communed with the spirit of the flying weapon. Even if he had wanted to back away, he was physically incapable of doing so. The sheer magnitude of the weapon's spirit overwhelmed him to the point where he was barely capable of retaining a proper train of thought. In an instant, Maverick realised that this flying weapon was unlike all the others. If the F-22 Raptor was a prize show horse, the A-10 Thunderbolt was a battle-scarred war dog. A more apt comparison would be that of a royal duelist of a lowly knight. The F-22 Raptor was like a well-groomed royal family member that stood at the rear of an army protected by royal guards. It had the benefit of the best training and equipment a kingdom could afford, and used both factors to its advantage to crush opponents it sought in honourable duels on the battlefield. It was arrogant and revelled in attaining personal glory that could be retold later at victory feasts and parades. It had no qualms ignoring the lowly commoner foot soldiers, for they had no use or purpose in its plans. The only reason the foot soldiers and commoners existed was to attract the attention of enemies that the F-22 could then swoop in and defeat in glorious single combat. The A-10 was completely different. It was like a grizzled knight of low birth that was barely one step above the common foot soldiers it fought alongside. The A-10 was looked down on by the other nobles and knights, for it fought alongside the common soldiers, not for glory or wealth, but because it genuinely cared about them and wanted to protect them from the worst the enemy could throw at them. The A-10 cared not for honourable duels or personal accolades. It would do whatever it took to protect the foot soldiers under them. It would happily dirty its armour in the mud and filth so as to get closer to the enemy. It would gladly take the brunt of the enemy's wrath if it gave the common foot soldiers a chance to escape from danger. It would willingly crush swaths of enemy troops in one-sided bloodbaths if it meant that the commoners would be spared the chance of defeat. It had no need for medals or tales of glory. The protection of its troops came first. If they were humans, the F-22 would retire from the battlefield whenever it wanted so as to maintain its perfect appearance and strength. It would have its own large tent full of the best armour and weapons the kingdom had to offer, and a retinue of perfectly mannered attendants to fulfill its every need. Its armour would always be polished to shine, and even the smallest amount of damage to its armour meant it needed to be replaced to maintain its perfect look. The A-10 would be on the battlefield until it nearly passed out from exhaustion, or until it was covered in wounds. When it did return to camp, it was to a meagre tent with only the bare necessities. The A-10 would be lucky if it had more than one squire, and they would be ragged commoners who looked like they were one step above homeless beggars. The A-10 cared not for the appearance of its armour. As long as it functioned, it was good enough. Dents could be hammered out, holes could be patched, and armour pieces were only replaced if they were damaged beyond repair. The A-10 would only return to camp to quickly replenish its strength and repair its weapons. As soon as it was able to, the A-10 would be charging back off to the battlefield wherever it was needed. When the battle was over, the F-22 would retire to royal palaces and attend high-class banquets and balls. It would be dressed in the finest silks or decorative armour, and spend their time regaling nobles and royals with glorious tales of their latest duels. The A-10 would not leave the battlefield until either the enemy had fled over the horizon, or they lay as corpses at its feet. It would exchange its bloody and rusted armour for rough cloth fabric, and find the nearest tavern or pub that had anything remotely close to alcohol. There it would spend the night carousing with the commoners and foot soldiers until the wee hours of the morning. Any attempt by the commoners to celebrate the A-10's glory would be dismissed by the night. Instead, it would praise the foot soldiers for fighting valiantly at its side, and raising toasts to their comrades that died. It would compare battle scars with others, participate in drinking contests, and get into the occasional brawl if anyone dared insult its comrades. Maverick felt beads of cold sweat prickle his scalp as the memories of the A-10 flooded his mind. It was a veteran of dozens of missions, and had been fighting twice as long as the nearby F-22 had been alive. Maverick watched from the A-10's point of view as it lumbered through the sky with pure hate spewing from its mouth as it tore its targets to shreds for daring to harm his beloved grunts. Maverick felt nausea seize his stomach as the A-10 told him its tale of horror and death, the machine revelling in completely destroying all that dared stand against it. Corpses and scenes of death rushed past Maverick's eyes in a horrifying display of strength, and the dwarf wondered if this was not a spirit, but a demon. But in between those scenes of carnage and hate were brief moments of despair and regret. Unlike the F-22, the A-10 could hear the voices of the grunts it protected. The F-22 only heard the calm and collected voices of the commanders and tacticians through the radio. The A-10 listened directly to the grunts on the ground, and as a result heard every single nuance and emotion of those on the ground. What the A-10 heard were not the dispassionate voices of tacticians, but the raw sounds of the battlefield and its combatants. It heard the bullets snapping past the grunt's head as they called out directions and coordinates in shaky voices. It heard the muffled explosions and pings of shrapnel as the grunts screamed frantically into their radios for help. It heard the final breaths of soldiers as they clutched their radios with bloody hands and called in strikes until their last moments. Maverick felt the machine's spirit howl in agony as it remembered all those it had lost. For the A-10, the death of every grunt meant it had failed. Maverick listened as the wounded A-10 cried in regret. If only it had been faster, if only it had fired one more bullet, if only it had flown lower. All of these thoughts and more filled the A-10 with the kind of hate and rage usually reserved for vengeful mothers. Maverick shivered in fear as he saw the A-10 slaughter all those it targeted with a hateful wrath that bordered on insanity. It truly was like a beast of war, roaring and charging towards the enemy, the distinctive whistle of its engines. Maverick listened as the A-10 proudly recounted all the slogans that had been painted on its fuselage or weapons by affectionate pilots and ground crews. Go ugly early, fuck around and find out, go on hog wild. The A-10 knew it and its kin were looked down on by others. It knew that Air Force leadership had been trying to replace it for years. It knew that many other planes regarded it as an ugly relic of the past. But if it could have, the A-10 would have grinned smugly, for even after all those years, the Air Force still needed it. No other plane was willing to get low and take hits like an A-10 could. The A-10 might be a single-minded beast of destruction, but it did not care. Until there was a suitable replacement, the A-10 would always be needed. It did not care about accomplishments or trophies, for the best reward it could ever receive was the thanks of the grunts on the ground. Maverick shivered when he realized that A-10 was now directly focusing on him. Unbelievably, the aircraft did to Maverick what the dwarf thought only he could do to weapons. It looked through its memories and listened to his story. And now it was angry. Maverick wanted to pull his hand away, but his body was frozen in place like the A-10 had reached out and grabbed him by the throat. With the authority and wrath of a battle-scarred veteran, the A-10 made it very clear what would happen to Maverick and the dwarves should they follow through on their plan of conquering the human race. The humans might not be able to hear the voices of the machines and weapons they created, but their creations would lovingly defend them no matter the cost. The A-10 was giving Maverick a single warning. If the World Council started a war with the humans, it would be their end. Human weapons were killers without equal, and the only way it would end would be with the extermination of everything Maverick knew and loved. Right before the battle-scarred A-10 released its grip on Maverick's mind, it left him a parting gift. The aircraft filled Maverick's head with the bone-chilling sound that would herald the death of all World Council races should they harm the A-10's grunts.